The silence in the house was the first thing that hit you. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, but a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed down on Alara Vance. Her bare feet felt the chill of the hardwood floor as she stood in the center of the living room, the crisp, cruel paper of the foreclosure notice clutched in her hand. A tremor ran through her fingers. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Outside, a cold wind howled, rattling the window panes like skeletal fingers trying to get in. She was 42, a former librarian, now a widow drowning in a sea of misfortunes. The memory of her husband's laugh felt like a ghost haunting these walls. A quiet cough from the doorway broke the stillness. It was her son, 10-year-old Liam, his face a pale mask of worry. She forced a smile that felt like cracking glass. Her stomach twisted, not just from the gnawing hunger, but from the raw, acidic taste of fear. She checked her phone again, the screen glaring in the dim light. The bank balance hadn't magically changed. $317 down, $317 to stand between her children and the street. The number that truly stole her breath was larger. A monstrous figure that lived on a teetering stack of envelopes on the kitchen counter. Over $200,000. The medical debt from her husband's final, agonizing weeks. Each envelope was a fresh stab of pain, the bold and red letters of past due screaming at her. She could almost smell the hospital again, that sterile, chemical scent of antiseptic and despair that clung to everything. The rhythmic, soulless beep of the machines that had measured the last moments of his life still echoed in her ears. The official report called it a workplace accident, a phrase so bland, so sterile, it felt like a lie. Alara felt a wave of dizziness. Her body ached with a fatigue that went bone deep, a constant, physical reminder of her grief and the crushing weight of a debt she could never hope to repay. Her world, once filled with the quiet rustle of turning pages and the scent of old books, had collapsed into this single, terrifying point of insolvency. She was suffocating under the immense, unmovable weight of it all. She felt a small, cold hand slip into hers. It was Chloe, her 7-year-old daughter, her wide, blue eyes filled with a confusion that shattered Alara's heart into a million tiny pieces. Chloe didn't say anything. She just held on, her small body trembling slightly. For dinner, they had split the last can of soup, the thin, watery broth doing little to quiet the protesting growl in their stomachs. Alara's own hunger was a familiar, dull ache she had learned to ignore, but hearing the faint rumble from her children's bellies was a physical torment, a hot poker twisting in her gut. A lump of nausea rose in her throat. She was failing them. The thought was a relentless hammer blow to her soul. She had promised to protect them, to always keep them safe, and now she couldn't even promise them a roof over their heads for another week. Silent tears began to trace cold paths down her cheeks, and she quickly wiped them away before Liam could see. He was trying so hard to be the man of the house. His small shoulders squared, but she saw the fear lurking behind his brave facade. Less than a week. The words from the foreclosure notice were burned into her mind, repeating on a loop. The official document lay on the table, its stark, impersonal font a brutal contrast to the hand-drawn pictures taped to the refrigerator nearby. It felt less like a legal notice and more like an execution order for the life she had known. Her gaze drifted around the room, landing on the half-packed cardboard boxes. Each item she touched, a worn-out sweater of his, a chipped coffee mug, a book of poetry he loved, unleashed a fresh wave of grief. These weren't just things. They were the artifacts of a shared history, a future that had been violently ripped away. The air in the room felt thick and heavy, making each breath a conscious effort. A cold sweat slicked her skin. Panic, cold and sharp, began to crawl up her spine, tightening its icy grip around her chest. The silent, screaming question echoed off the bare walls, growing louder with every beat of her frantic heart. Where will we go? What will we do? There was no answer, just the relentless, deafening silence of absolute despair. The finality of it all pressed down on her, a physical weight that made her want to collapse onto the cold floor. $317, less than a week. 2 children who looked to her for a safety she could no longer provide. The house, once a warm sanctuary filled with the sounds of family, now felt like a cold, echoing tomb, its emptiness amplifying the frantic drumming of her own heart. She felt utterly, terrifyingly alone, A single ship lost in a violent, endless storm. In the back of her mind, a dark, unsettling question about her husband's accident squirmed, a seed of suspicion she was too exhausted and grief-stricken to water. But it was there, a shadow in the corner of her vision, a whisper beneath the howl of the wind. Her entire world had been reduced to this single, desperate moment of impending doom. Trapped by debt and grief, with nowhere to turn, Alara's story of survival is just beginning. What would you do with your last $300 and 2 children to protect? Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications, because the shocking answer she finds is one you cannot afford to miss. The shrill ring of the telephone was a violent intrusion into the suffocating quiet. Alara flinched, her heart leaping into her throat. Every call was a potential landmine. Another creditor with a voice dripping in false sympathy before delivering a verbal blow. She let it ring 3 times, her breath held tight in her chest, before her trembling hand finally picked up. It wasn't a creditor. It was her husband's lawyer, his voice a calm, professional baritone that felt alien in her world of frantic panic. After offering clipped condolences, he got to the point. Ms. Vance, in reviewing the estate, we found a single asset that was not leveraged and therefore not seized by creditors. Alara felt a strange, painful flutter in her chest. It was hope, so unfamiliar it felt like a shard of glass. A single asset. The words echoed in the empty room, a tiny pinprick of light in an endless, suffocating darkness. She gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles turning white as she strained to hear. The lawyer explained. It was a piece of property, a small lake house in a remote part of the state. It had been inherited years ago from a great-uncle her husband had never even met, a forgotten relic from a distant branch of the family tree. The deed was free and clear. The words, sole remaining asset, and your only option, hung in the air between them. It wasn't a choice. It was a lifeline, however frayed and thin. Her mind, numb with grief and anxiety, struggled to process the information. A house, a roof, a place to go. A wave of lightheadedness washed over her, and she sank into a chair, the plastic of the phone slick with sweat against her ear. She scribbled down the address on the back of a discarded envelope, her handwriting a barely legible scrawl. The lawyer's voice faded as a single, overwhelming thought consumed her. We are not going to be homeless. The fragile relief was so potent, so utterly overpowering, that she felt tears begin to stream down her face once more. But this time, they weren't tears of despair. The energy in the small apartment shifted. The cardboard boxes, once symbols of defeat, were now vessels of a desperate exodus. A mission. There was a frantic, feverish quality to their packing now. Liam, seeing a flicker of purpose in his mother's eyes for the first time in weeks, worked with a silent, fierce determination, carefully wrapping their few dishes in old t-shirts. Chloe organized her worn stuffed animals into a suitcase. To fund the journey, Alara had to make one final, heart-wrenching sacrifice. She went to a dusty pawn shop, the bell above the door chiming like a death knell. She slid her gold wedding band and her husband's worn silver watch across the glass counter. The shopkeeper, a man with tired eyes, counted out a few crumpled bills without a word. Each dollar felt both like a betrayal and a sacrament. That night, she held the small wad of cash in her hand. It wasn't much, but it was gas money. It was escape money. It was the price of a future, paid for with the last tangible pieces of her past. The morning they left, a heavy fog blanketed the city, muffling sound and sight. It felt fitting. Alara did one last walk-through of the empty apartment, the echo of her footsteps a lonely sound. She placed the key on the kitchen counter, a final, quiet surrender. In the car, the silence was thick with unspoken emotions. Liam and Chloe were pressed against the rear windows, watching their neighborhood, their school, their entire world slide past and disappear into the gray mist. The car, an old station wagon groaning under the weight of their condensed lives, felt claustrophobically small. Alara focused on the road ahead, her grip tight on the steering wheel. She didn't dare look in the rearview mirror, terrified that a single glance at the life she was leaving behind would shatter her fragile resolve. She was driving away from a mountain of debt and a foreclosure, but it felt less like an escape and more like a banishment into an unknown, unforgiving wilderness. The hours on the highway melted into a monotonous drone of humming tires on asphalt. The sprawling suburbs gave way to flat, empty farmland, the landscape growing more desolate with every mile marker. They ate stale crackers that scratched their throats and drank lukewarm water from a plastic jug. Alara felt a low-grade hum of anxiety beneath her skin, a constant companion to the thin sliver of hope she nurtured like a tiny flame. Then, the cheerful, disembodied voice of the GPS announced it had lost its signal. The smooth highway devolved into a cracked county road, which then narrowed into a gravel track spitting stones against the car's undercarriage. The familiar sounds of civilization, the distant traffic, the faint sirens, vanished completely. They were replaced by the incessant, high-pitched buzz of insects and the rustle of unseen things in the dense woods that crowded the road. A primal sense of isolation began to creep into the car, cold and unwelcome. The trees grew taller and thicker, their gnarled branches reaching for each other above the path, creating a tunnel of perpetual gloom. Sunlight struggled to pierce the dense canopy, dappling the road in disorienting, shifting patterns of light and shadow. A damp, cloying smell of wet earth and decaying leaves seeped through the vents, filling the car with the scent of nature's slow decomposition. Alara's stomach, already tight with nerves, clenched painfully. This was not the idyllic, sun-dappled lakeside she had allowed herself to picture in her most desperate moments. The air grew heavy, humid, and still. The car bucked and lurched as the dirt track became a pair of deep, muddy ruts. The sound of the suspension groaning in protest was a painful, metallic screech. The fragile flame of hope inside her began to flicker violently as a cold, slick tendril of dread started to coil itself around her heart. She was driving her children into the middle of nowhere. The trees finally parted, revealing the lake. Alara's heart, which had been tentatively rising, sank like a stone. The water wasn't the sparkling blue she had fantasized about, but a vast, unnerving expanse of murky, brown sludge. A thick carpet of green algae covered its surface, and the water itself looked unnaturally still and heavy. A truly foul odor, a pungent mix of stagnant water and rotting vegetation, wafted towards them, so strong it made her gag. Near the shoreline, a single, dead tree stood like a skeletal sentinel, its bare branches clawing at the overcast sky. The silence here was different from the silence in the city. It was a deep, oppressive quiet, punctuated only by the whine of mosquitoes gathering at the car windows. Liam and Chloe, who had been chattering with nervous excitement, fell silent. The hope that had carried Alara all this way began to curdle, souring into a thick, nauseating horror. This place felt wrong. It felt dead. And then she saw the house, her breath caught in a sharp, painful gasp. It was a caricature of a dwelling, a grotesque skeleton of a building hunched near the water's edge. It sagged dramatically to one side as if the very earth were trying to swallow it whole. The front porch had given up long ago. Its roof collapsed into a splintered, chaotic pile of rotting timbers. The windows were dark, hollow sockets, many of them shattered, leaving jagged teeth of glass in their frames. The original paint had surrendered to the elements, peeling away in long, diseased-looking strips to reveal the weathered, corpse-gray wood beneath. The dread that had been coiling in her gut tightened into a solid, ice-cold knot. This wasn't a refuge. It wasn't a sanctuary. It was a grave. The lawyer's words, a small lake house, felt like the punchline to a cruel cosmic joke played at her expense. She had driven them straight into a nightmare. She forced her car door open, the creak loud in the tomb-like silence. The air that rushed in was thick and wet, a physical presence that seemed to coat her skin and lungs instantly. The smell of decay was overwhelming now, a gut-wrenching symphony of mildew, mud, and something else, something vaguely like spoiled meat. It clung to the back of her throat. She could hear the faint, dry scuttling of invisible creatures in the overgrown weeds that choked what might have once been a yard. From the car, she heard Chloe let out a small whimper. "Stay here," Alara commanded, her voice sounding thin and unfamiliar to her own ears. She forced her leaden feet to move, each step towards the derelict structure feeling like she was wading through a swamp of despair. A violent shiver, one born of pure terror and not the clammy air, racked her body. She was walking towards the final, definitive proof of her failure as a mother and a provider. The front door hung crookedly on a single, rusted hinge. When Alara pushed it, it emitted a deep, protracted groan, the sound of tortured wood giving way. It only opened a foot before stopping, blocked by a pile of debris inside. She sucked in a breath of the putrid air and squeezed her body through the narrow gap. The interior was a cavern of shadows and dampness. Her eyes struggled to adjust to the gloom, but she could immediately see the source of the blockage. A huge section of the living room ceiling had rotted through and collapsed, leaving a jagged, gaping hole open to the gray sky. A mound of soggy insulation, splintered rafters, and dead leaves lay in a heap on the floor. Rainwater had been dripping through the hole for what must have been years, creating a slick, black pool of sludge on the warped and buckled floorboards. Her heart didn't just sink, it plummeted into a black, bottomless abyss. The stench inside was a physical assault, far more potent than it had been outside. The sharp, acrid reek of black mold was everywhere, so concentrated it made her eyes burn and her throat constrict. It grew in huge, cancerous-looking blooms across the walls, its dark tendrils spreading over the damp, peeling floral wallpaper like a creeping plague. The few pieces of furniture that remained, a sofa, a solitary armchair, were swollen and distorted by the relentless moisture, their fabric covered in a fine, sickly green-gray fuzz. From somewhere in the darkness, she could hear a sound that would soon become the soundtrack to her despair. The slow, maddening, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water striking the floor. It was a relentless, aquatic torture, each drop a tiny hammer blow against her sanity. A feeling of profound nausea rose from her stomach, hot and acidic. She felt dizzy, her vision swimming at the edges. She forced herself to take a few more steps, her sneakers making a disgusting squelching sound with each footfall on the sodden floor. Suddenly, a large rat, sleek and wet, darted from behind the ruined sofa and scurried directly across her path. Its tiny claws made a scratching sound on the wood before it disappeared into a hole in the wall. Alara let out a small, strangled cry, stumbling backward. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to clench them into fists. She peered into the kitchen, a horror show of rusted-out appliances and cabinet doors hanging precariously from their hinges. On the windowsill, desiccated and grim, lay the tiny skeleton of a dead bird. The sense of total, absolute isolation crashed down on her. They were miles from the nearest town, with no cell service, no way to call for help. No one in the world even knew they were here. The fragile hope she had so carefully guarded during the long drive shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She hadn't saved her children. She had dragged them from a home with no money to a ruin with no hope. Here, there was no electricity to give them light, no clean water to drink, no lock on the door to keep them safe. There was only this oppressive dampness, this relentless decay, and this terrifying, all-encompassing solitude. The nausea crested, and she doubled over, gagging, bracing her hand against a nearby wall to keep from falling. Her palm met a surface that was cold, slimy, and yielding. She snatched her hand back with a gasp of disgust, wiping it frantically on her jeans. She felt the last dregs of her strength, the adrenaline that had fueled her for weeks, drain out of her body, leaving her utterly hollowed out, a fragile shell trembling on the verge of collapse. She had gambled everything on this one last chance, and she had lost spectacularly. Staggering, she stumbled back out through the narrow gap in the doorway, gasping for air that wasn't saturated with the smell of mold and rot. She leaned heavily against the side of her old car, pressing her forehead against the cool, solid metal of the door as she tried to fight back the black wave of panic threatening to drown her. The hope of the lake house had been a cruel, vicious trick of the light, a shimmering mirage in the desert of her grief that had led her to this dead end. She felt more trapped now than she had in the apartment with the foreclosure notice. She was stranded. Tears of pure, hot rage began to burn her eyes. Rage at her late husband for leaving her this mess. Rage at the lawyer for sending her here. But mostly, a gut-wrenching rage at herself for her own gullibility, her own desperation. She had sold the last remnants of her life with the man she loved to purchase passage to this hell. A small, hesitant voice from the back seat cut through the roaring in her ears. "Mommy, It was Chloe, her face a pale circle in the dim light of the car's interior. Is this our new home? Ilara looked from Chloe's wide, trusting eyes to Liam's, who was staring at the dilapidated shack with a look of silent, dawning horror. That unwavering trust in her daughter's voice felt like a hot brand on her skin, a searing indictment of her failure. She had led them to the literal end of the world, to a forgotten, rotting place where hope was a foreign currency. The immense, crushing weight of her powerlessness settled on her chest, making it difficult to draw a full breath. She had been searching for the bottom, and she had finally found it. Here, stranded in the wilderness with two terrified children, with nothing but the ghosts of a dead man's forgotten secrets for company, Ilara Vance had finally, truly, hit rock bottom. The days bled into a grueling routine, a desperate battle against the house's decay. Each morning, Ilara woke to the damp chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls, a cold that seeped into her bones and never truly left. Her first thought was always the children. She would listen for their soft breathing, the only sound in the house that wasn't one of rot or despair. Their main source of food was the meager supply of canned goods she had brought, now dwindling at an alarming rate. She rationed every spoonful, her own stomach a tight, aching knot of hunger she ignored. She felt a constant, low-grade fever of anxiety, her body thrumming with the effort of just holding herself together. The silence of the lake was a constant pressure against her ears, a heavy, listening quiet that made her feel watched. She forced herself to move, to work, to fight, because the alternative, to give in to the suffocating hopelessness of this place, was a luxury she could not afford. The house was trying to swallow them, and she had to fight back. Her singular focus became a small, less overgrown patch of earth behind the house. A garden. It was a desperate, almost pathetic act of defiance against their grim reality. If she could make something grow in this dead place, it would be a victory. She found a rusted shovel with a splintered handle in the collapsing boathouse, and the work became her therapy. The physical strain, the sting of blisters on her soft hands, the smell of the rich, dark soil. It was real, a welcome distraction from the corrosive fear that ate at her during the long, silent nights. Liam worked beside her, a quiet, serious shadow. He never complained. He just dug, his thin arms straining with the effort, his face set with a determination that both broke her heart and filled her with a fierce, protective pride. They were trying to claw a future out of the mud, one shovelful at a time. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and the faint, ever-present odor of decay from the lake. Their world was this small patch of dirt. It happened on the third day of their toil. The sun was a weak, watery disk in the gray sky. The only sounds were the rhythmic scrape and thud of their shovels and the maddening buzz of lake flies. Liam, clearing a patch of stubborn weeds, thrust his shovel into the ground. Instead of the familiar soft resistance of earth, there was a harsh, metallic clank that echoed loudly in the oppressive quiet. The sound was so alien, so out of place, that they both froze instantly. Liam looked at her, his eyes wide. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. A tremor, not of cold this time, but of something else, ran through Ilara. Her heart gave a sudden, hard thump against her ribs. In a place where every inch of ground was soft with rot and soil, the sound of solid metal was an anomaly, a question mark thrown into their miserable existence. She felt a prickle of unease on the back of her neck. Something was buried here, something that was not meant to be found. She knelt beside him, her knees sinking into the damp soil. "Here," she said, her own voice tight. "Let me." She took the shovel and began to dig carefully around the spot where Liam had struck something. The metal object was shallow, buried only a few inches down. Soon, the curved, rust-pocked edge of a small box emerged from the dark earth. It was a simple metal case, no bigger than a shoebox, its surface eaten away by years of moisture. A wave of something akin to adrenaline, a feeling she hadn't experienced since the frantic packing, surged through her. Her hands, caked in dirt, trembled slightly as she worked her fingers underneath it, feeling the cold, rough metal. With a grunt of effort, she heaved it from its earthy grave. It was heavier than it looked, its weight solid and real. Liam watched, his breath held in a silent gasp, his face a mixture of boyish excitement and the learned caution of their new life. The box had a simple, rusted latch. Elara fumbled with it for a moment, the metal gritty under her fingernails. With a final, sharp tug, it gave way with a piercing screech of protest, a sound like a small animal's cry of pain. The hinges, equally corroded, groaned as she lifted the lid. For a moment, her heart sank. The inside was almost entirely filled with dirt and rotted, black leaves that had wormed their way in over the decades. A damp, musty smell, the scent of a long-dead secret, wafted out. It seemed to be another dead end, another piece of worthless junk that this derelict property was so full of. Disappointment, sharp and familiar, lanced through her. Of course it was nothing. Hope was a fool's game in this place. She was about to toss it aside when her fingers, sifting through the grime, brushed against something small, solid, and cold. It wasn't a rock, it was smooth, and it was man-made. Her fingers closed around the object, and she pulled it out. It lay in her palm, caked in mud. She wiped it clean on her jeans, her movements slow and deliberate. As the dirt fell away, a dull metallic gleam caught the weak light. It was a cufflink, a single, tarnished silver cufflink, elegantly shaped. It was heavy, far heavier than it should be. She turned it over and over in her hand, the cold metal a strange contrast to her warm skin. Then she saw them. Engraved on its face in a looping, elegant script were two initials, J.A. A chill, entirely unrelated to the damp air, snaked its way up her spine. J.A. The letters meant nothing to her, yet they felt important, significant. This wasn't a random piece of trash. This was personal. This was deliberately hidden. A new question, the first in a long time that wasn't about survival, began to form in her mind. Who was J.A.? And why was their cufflink buried in a box behind this forgotten house? That evening, a storm rolled in across the lake, turning the already gray sky a bruised, angry purple. The wind shrieked around the corners of the house, and rain began to lash against the broken windows, driven by the gale. The temperature inside the house plummeted, and the relentless drip, drip, drip from the hole in the ceiling picked up its pace, becoming a frantic, maddening tattoo. Trapped inside the damp, rotting structure, the cufflink felt like a hot coal in Elara's pocket. The house no longer felt just abandoned. It felt secretive. The weight of its history pressed in on her. She found herself staring at the warped floorboards in the living room, the place where the dampness was worst. They buckled and bowed in grotesque waves, slick with moisture and a thin film of green algae. They were a constant hazard, and Chloe had already tripped on them twice. With the storm raging outside, she decided she had to do something about it. It was a task born of necessity, a way to fight back against the encroaching chaos. She took the rusted shovel from the garden, its edge now a tool for demolition. Prying up the rotten boards was grim work. The wood was soft and spongy, splintering with a wet, tearing sound. It came apart in soggy, foul-smelling chunks, revealing the dark, damp earth beneath. The air filled with the potent, gagging stench of mold and decay released from under the floor. She worked under the dim, flickering light of a single candle, the shadows dancing around her like grotesque specters. Her back ached and her hands were raw, but she kept going, fueled by a strange, restless energy. The cufflink in her pocket felt like a silent observer, urging her on. The initials J.A. were a persistent echo in her thoughts, a riddle she felt compelled to solve. She was tearing apart the house, looking for an answer to a question she didn't even know how to ask. She had cleared a small section near the center of the room, where the collapse from the ceiling was worst. Most of the planks were completely rotted through, but one of them resisted the edge of her shovel. It was different. While the boards around it were soft and waterlogged, this one felt solid, firm. She knelt, her candle casting a pool of wavering golden light onto the floor. She ran her hand over the wood. It was damp, but not spongy. It was made of a darker, denser wood than the surrounding pine floorboards. She pushed on it. It didn't buckle. Instead, it shifted, just a fraction of an inch, with a low, woody groan. Her breath caught in her throat. She pushed again, harder this time. The plank moved. It wasn't warped into place by water damage. It was loose. Her heart began to beat a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of fear and electrifying curiosity. Her mind immediately flashed to the metal box, to the initials J. A. This couldn't be a coincidence. It was a pattern, a secret buried in the garden, and now a secret hidden in the floor. The house was giving up its ghosts, one by one. With trembling hands, she wedged the corner of the shovel into the seam of the plank and pushed down. The wood resisted for a moment, then gave way with a deep scrape of wood on wood. It didn't splinter. It lifted, cleanly, in one piece. It had been cut, deliberately. She lifted the plank away and set it aside, her hands shaking so much she could barely hold it. The candle flame flickered violently, and she shielded it with her body, peering into the darkness she had just uncovered. For a moment she saw nothing but a black, rectangular void, a patch of absolute darkness that seemed to swallow the candlelight. A cold, musty air, devoid of the smell of mold, wafted up to meet her. Slowly, her eyes adjusted. It wasn't just earth beneath. She was looking at another layer of wood, a false bottom, a carefully constructed cover set into the joists of the floor. This was no accident of construction. This was a hiding place. A cold dread mixed with a feverish excitement coursed through her veins. This was real. She ran her dirty fingers over the surface of the hidden lid. It was smooth, professionally done. Near one edge, her fingers found a small, circular indentation, a finger pull carved into the wood. She hesitated for only a second, the sound of her own ragged breathing loud in the storm-whipped silence. The children were asleep in the driest corner of the adjoining room, oblivious. She was alone with this discovery. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she hooked her fingers into the pull and lifted. The panel was unexpectedly heavy, and it opened with a soft whoosh of displaced air. The space beneath was small, no more than 2 feet square, and it was lined with a dull, heavy-looking gray metal. Lead. A sudden, bizarre thought from a long-forgotten science class surfaced in her mind. Lead blocks radiation, but more practically, it was dense, waterproof, and would protect against rot. This compartment was built to last. It was built to protect something priceless from the very decay that had consumed the rest of the house. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. The initial thrill of discovery was rapidly being replaced by a much heavier emotion: fear. Whatever was in here, someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it hidden and preserved. This was not a child's secret stash. This was something serious, something dangerous. She held the candle closer, its light trembling in her unsteady hand, and peered into the lead-lined cavity. The first thing she saw was a bundle wrapped in dark, greasy-looking oilcloth. It was shaped like a brick, heavy and dense. Beside it lay a smaller, flatter package, a dark rectangle sealed in what looked like a waterproof pouch. Her gaze was fixed on the oilcloth bundle. With a hand that felt disconnected from her body, she reached in. The air in the compartment was cool and still. Her fingers closed around the bundle. It was surprisingly heavy, its weight solid and unnerving. She lifted it out and placed it carefully on the floor beside her. The oilcloth was cool and slightly slick to the touch. It smelled faintly of oil and metal, a clean, industrial scent that was a shocking contrast to the house's overwhelming stench of mildew. For a moment, she just stared at it, her mind a whirlwind of frantic, unformed questions. What had she just found? And more importantly, what was she going to do with it? Her fingers, clumsy with adrenaline, fumbled with the folds of the thick, waxed fabric. She unwrapped it slowly, layer by layer, as if peeling back the skin of a long-dead secret. The last layer of cloth fell away, and there it was, lying on the dirty floor, gleaming a malevolent dark blue in the candlelight, was a revolver. It was a .38 caliber, squat and serious, its metal perfectly preserved, untouched by the decades of damp that had destroyed everything else. It looked pristine, almost new, the oil from the cloth giving it a faint, deadly sheen. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over Alara. She felt dizzy, her vision swimming. This wasn't money. This wasn't jewelry. This was a gun, a weapon, a symbol of violence and death, hidden away like a cursed treasure. A low gasp escaped her lips, a sound of pure shock. The mystery of J.A. had just taken a dark, terrifying turn. She couldn't touch it. She just stared, her mind struggling to process the sight. 100 questions screamed through her mind, all of them terrifying. Whose gun was this? Why was it hidden here in her husband's family's forgotten property? Was it connected to the cufflink? Was Jay a killer? The gun lay there, inert but radiating a palpable aura of menace. It was the physical manifestation of a violent secret. The discovery of the cufflink had been a curiosity, a breadcrumb. This was a bombshell. This changed everything. It transformed the house from a forgotten ruin into the scene of a potential crime. It transformed her from a desperate survivor into the custodian of a dangerous piece of evidence. A cold, primal fear, deeper than anything she had felt before, took root in her gut. She felt as though she had lifted a rock and found something venomous and deadly coiled beneath it. Her gaze shifted from the gun to the other object still lying in the lead-lined compartment, the waterproof pouch. It suddenly seemed infinitely more important than the revolver. A gun was a tool, but the pouch could hold answers. With a renewed sense of urgency, she reached back into the hole and retrieved it. It was made of a thick, rubberized canvas, and it was sealed tight. She used the edge of the shovel to pry open the stiff, hardened seal. It tore with a rasping sound, and the smell of old, dry leather and paper drifted out, a scent from another time. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The story. She tipped the pouch upside down, and two items slid out into her waiting palm. The first was a small, leather-bound diary, its cover worn smooth with time but miraculously intact. The second was a small, flat stack of photographic negatives, bundled together with a brittle rubber band. She picked up the diary first, her fingers tracing the supple, dry leather. It felt ancient, sacred. There were no markings on the cover. It was completely anonymous. The pages were yellowed with age but crisp and dry, protected perfectly by the pouch. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting inside was small and spidery, written in a faded blue ink. It was tight, cramped, as if the writer were trying to cram a lifetime of secrets into the small volume. She could only make out the first few words, written in a slightly larger script, almost like a title. My debt to Julian Ashford. A name. Julian Ashford. J.A. Her blood ran cold. It was him, the man from the cufflink. This was his story, or a story about him. The loop was closing. The mystery was beginning to unravel, and she was standing at the very center of it. She felt a jolt of terror and a simultaneous, undeniable pull of compulsion. She had to know. She quickly set the diary aside, her hands shaking, and picked up the negatives. The rubber band that held them together crumbled to dust the moment she touched it. There were perhaps a dozen of them, each a small, translucent rectangle of plastic. She held one up, angling it to catch the flickering candlelight. The image was a ghostly inversion of reality. It was blurry, taken in low light. The figures within it little more than indistinct shapes and shadows. But it was undeniably a scene. It looked like two men standing over something on the ground, near what could be a car. One of the figures was tall and broad, the other leaner. It was impossible to make out any faces or details, but the feeling it gave off was one of urgency, of secrecy, of a moment that was never meant to be captured. A blurry photo showing Ashford at a murder scene. The thought, from the premisa, hit her like a physical blow. Her mind reeled, struggling to connect the pieces she held in her hands. A buried cufflink engraved with J.A., a hidden gun, a .38 caliber revolver, preserved like a holy relic. And now, a diary that mentioned a debt to a man named Julian Ashford, accompanied by clandestine photographs of a dark, unclear event. The narrative was no longer about her grief or her poverty. She had stumbled into someone else's story, a dark and violent tale that had been buried in this house for decades, waiting for someone to unearth it. The weight of the discovery settled on her, heavier than any debt. This wasn't a treasure that would save her. It was a secret that could destroy her. The air in the room felt thick, charged with the energy of the past. The storm outside raged on, its fury a perfect mirror for the tempest that had just been unleashed inside her. She sat back on her heels, the cold of the damp floor seeping through her jeans. Her body was trembling, a fine, uncontrollable shiver that was born of pure shock. In the span of an hour, her reality had been completely rewritten. She was no longer just a widow trying to survive. She was a witness. The house was no longer just a ruin. It was a tomb of secrets. The gun, the diary, the negatives. They lay before her in the small pool of candlelight like artifacts from a shipwreck, pieces of a disaster she was only now beginning to comprehend. The oppressive silence of the lake, the sense of being watched she had felt since she arrived, suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. This land didn't just hold memories, it held evidence, and now, that evidence was hers. The knowledge was a heavy, cold weight in her stomach. What had her husband's great-uncle been involved in? Who was Julian Ashford, and what did he do? The first loop had been the cufflink, leading her to question who J.A. was. That loop had led her here, to this hidden compartment. Now, a dozen new loops opened up before her like a nest of vipers. What was the debt the diary spoke of? What was the story of the gun? Who was the person on the ground in the blurry negative? Each piece of evidence was a new question. Each answer she might find promising only more danger. The genre of her life had irrevocably shifted. The simple, brutal drama of poverty had been replaced by the complex, terrifying script of a mystery. She was no longer fighting hunger or the elements. She was now entangled in a cold case, a hidden crime, and a secret that someone had clearly been willing to kill to protect. A cold sweat trickled down her temple. She was utterly alone, miles from civilization, with 2 sleeping children and a murderer's secret in her hands. A profound sense of dread washed over her, colder and more paralyzing than the damp air of the house. This discovery was not a path to salvation. It felt like a curse. The gun was not a tool for her protection. It was a link to a violent past that was now her present. The diary was not a story. It was a confession or an accusation that could get her killed. She thought of her husband's workplace accident, and a dark, previously unthinkable suspicion began to fester in her mind, a seed of terror that now had fertile ground in which to grow. Was it possible? Could there be a connection? The initials J, A, burned in her mind. Julian Ashford. The name felt like a threat, a shadow that had been looming over this property, over her family. For generations, she had come to this house seeking a refuge from her problems, but had instead found the epicenter of a far older, far more dangerous one. She carefully gathered the items. The gun, wrapped again in its oilcloth, felt monstrously heavy. The diary and negatives she slipped back into their waterproof pouch. She did not put them back in the lead-lined box. She couldn't. Leaving them felt like abandoning them to the darkness, but keeping them felt like holding a live grenade. She slid the loose plank back into place, the sound of the wood scraping against the floor loud and definitive. The secret was covered again, but it was no longer in the floor. It was with her. She stood up, her legs stiff and unsteady. The candle flame guttered, casting her long, distorted shadow against the mold-stained walls. She was no longer just a Lara Vance, grieving widow. She was now the keeper of the Ashford secret, a secret of guns and debts and blurry photographs taken in the dead of night, and she had no idea what to do next. The house seemed to hold its breath around her. The wind howled, and the rain beat a relentless rhythm, but inside a new kind of silence had fallen, the silence of a secret unearthed. Ilara clutched the waterproof pouch to her chest, its contents a heavy weight against her heart. She looked towards the room where her children were sleeping, their innocent faces a stark contrast to the dark knowledge she now possessed. The mystery had been uncovered, but the danger was just beginning. She had thought that hitting rock bottom was the worst thing that could happen. She was wrong. The worst thing was finding something in that darkness that was reaching back for her, something with a name. Julian Ashford. The fight for survival was over. The fight for the truth, and for her life, had just begun. The storm died with the dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and deceptively calm. Ilara waited, every nerve in her body stretched taut, until the soft, rhythmic breathing of Liam and Chloe from the corner of the room assured her they were deep in a sleep she feared she would never know again. The candle had burned down to a flickering stub, its weak light dancing over the spidery handwriting in the diary she held with trembling hands. The waterproof pouch lay beside her, the oilcloth-wrapped gun a dark, heavy presence that seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. She opened the small leather book. A dry, musty scent rose from the pages, the smell of a secret kept for 40 years. Her blood ran cold as she read the first line again, the name a death sentence whispered across time. My debt to Julian Ashford. She felt a profound sense of trespassing, of reading words never meant for the living, yet she couldn't stop. A terrible compulsion drove her onward, a need to know the truth that lay buried with her husband's family. The early pages, written in the cramped script of a man named Thomas Vance, painted a picture of bleak desperation that was sickeningly familiar to Ilara. He wrote of his return from a pointless war to a town with no jobs, of the gnawing hunger and the shame of being unable to provide. Then, he wrote of meeting Julian Ashford. Ashford was described not as a man, but as a force of nature, charismatic, ambitious, with a smile that promised fortunes and a gaze that saw straight through a man's weaknesses. They were two sides of the same coin of poverty, but where Thomas felt the crushing weight of despair, Ashford burned with a cold, predatory fire. Ilara felt a chill creep over her skin, a sickening empathy for this long-dead man. She understood the siren song of a charismatic savior when you were drowning. She recognized the dangerous allure of a promise, any promise, of a way out. Thomas Vance had been desperate, and Julian Ashford had been waiting for someone just like him. The diary's tone darkened abruptly. The entries became shorter, more furtive. Thomas wrote of late-night meetings, of poring over maps and schedules under the dim glow of a kerosene lamp. He wrote about the plan. It was audacious, terrifying. The Silver Creek Logging Company, the largest employer in the region, moved its entire payroll in cash every other Friday. It was a tempting, moving vault. Ashford had an inside source, a disgruntled clerk who provided the route and the timing. The details spilled across the page in a frantic scrawl. The blind corner on the old county highway, the timing of the guards, shift change, the sheer, intoxicating sum of money that could change their lives forever. Ilara felt her own breath catch in her throat. The musty scent of the diary was replaced in her mind by the sharp smell of pine sap and diesel fumes. The words weren't just a record, they were a portal, pulling her back to the moment a terrible choice was made. The entry for October 22nd, 1982, was just 3 sentences long, the handwriting jagged and sharp. It is done. God forgive us. No one was hurt. The stark simplicity of the words was more chilling than any long confession. Ilara could feel the adrenaline and terror vibrating off the page. Thomas wrote that the haul was more than they had ever dreamed. He described the heavy canvas bags, the smell of ink and paper and human sweat on the bundled stacks of cash. But a new tone crept into the writing, a thread of sour regret that tarnished the victory. He wrote of Ashford's unsettling calm during the heist, a calm that bordered on inhuman. While Thomas's hands shook so badly he could barely count his share, Ashford had been methodical, his eyes gleaming with a cold, triumphant light. A knot of ice formed in Ilara's stomach. This was the moment the partnership had fractured, the moment a desperate man realized he had allied himself with a monster. A week later, the true horror began to unfold. The pages became stained and slightly blurred in places, as if from sweat or tears. A witness, Thomas wrote, the words looking as though they were carved into the paper. A fisherman, old man Hemlock's boy. He saw us near the drop-off. He didn't see our faces, but he saw the car. The panic was a living thing on the page. Thomas described confronting Ashford, suggesting they lay low, that the boy probably saw nothing. Ashford's reply, as recorded in the diary, made Ilara's blood run cold. There's no such thing as probably, Tom. There are only loose ends. And loose ends have a way of becoming a noose. Ilara felt a wave of nausea so strong she had to close her eyes. The air in the room felt thick and hard to breathe. The faint, rhythmic dripping of water from the ceiling sounded like a ticking clock, counting down to a murder. The next entry was a barely coherent scrawl, the ink bleeding across the page. It was a confession born of terror and guilt. Ashford had summoned him to the lake house, this very house, under the pretense of moving the money. The witness was there, a young man, barely a boy, tied to a chair. Thomas wrote of pleading with Ashford, of begging him to just scare the boy. But Ashford was beyond reason. He used the .38, my gun, the one I brought for protection. He smiled when he did it. The sound, God, the sound echoed over the water. Ilara let out a choked sob. Her hand clamped over her mouth. Her gaze shot to the dark, oilcloth-wrapped bundle on the floor. The gun, the perfectly preserved revolver. It wasn't just evidence. It was the instrument of a cold-blooded execution. The secret she had unearthed wasn't just about a robbery. It was about a murder. A murder committed with a gun that now lay 3 feet from where she sat. The diary detailed the nightmare that followed. Thomas described being frozen in terror, a passenger in his own life, as Ashford worked with a chilling, detached efficiency. He weighted the body and rowed it out to the deepest part of the lake, dumping it into the murky, silent water without a flicker of emotion. Ashford's words to him, seared into Thomas's memory and now into Ilara's, were, "He was a loose end, Tom, a necessary cost of doing business. Now we are bound by it. You breathe a word, and you go down for all of it." That was the trap. Thomas was an accomplice, his hands stained with the same blood. His only act of defiance was to steal back the murder weapon while Ashford cleaned up. He hid the gun, the diary, and the blurry negatives he had desperately snapped from the woods that night. It was his insurance policy, a dead man's switch against the monster he had helped create, a monster who had a name. The last few pages of the diary were a descent into paranoia. Thomas Vance lived the rest of his short life as a prisoner of his secret. He watched, helpless, as Julian Ashford used the blood money to build an empire. He bought the Silver Creek Logging Company, then the mills, then half the county. He became a respected figure, a pillar of the community. His success built on a foundation of stolen cash and the body of a boy at the bottom of a lake. Thomas wrote about Ashford's repeated, persistent offers to buy the lake house property, the last piece of unsecured land that tied him to his past. Thomas always refused. The final entry was dated 2 days before his official cause of death, a massive heart attack. "He knows I know. I see it in his eyes. He's coming for this place. He's coming for me." Ilara slammed the diary shut, the sound like a gunshot in the silent room. The heart attack was no accident. Ashford had cleaned up the final loose end. For 2 days, Ilara lived in a fog of pure terror. The knowledge she possessed was a physical weight, a tumor of fear growing in her gut. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was the sole heir to a 40-year-old secret that had already cost at least 2 lives. Every creak of the rotting floorboards, every rustle of leaves in the wind was Ashford coming for her. The silence of the lake was no longer peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a graveyard. The children's innocent laughter felt like a beacon, drawing danger toward them. She had to hide the evidence. With trembling hands, she wrapped the gun, the diary, and the negatives in layers of plastic bags, and stuffed the bundle deep inside the spare tire in the back of the old station wagon. It was a pathetic hiding place, but it was all she had. She felt utterly, terrifyingly exposed, a mouse hiding from a hawk in an open field. On the 3rd morning, the sound came. It was a low, powerful thrum that vibrated through the floorboards and up Ilara's spine. A sound completely alien to this world of decay and silence. The purr of a high-performance engine. It grew steadily, confidently, chewing up the muddy track that had so tormented her own vehicle. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She scrambled to the broken window, her breath fogging a small patch of glass. A sleek, black sedan, polished to a mirror shine, was parting the overgrown weeds like a shark cutting through water. It stopped. The engine cut out, and the sudden silence was more deafening than the noise had been. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead. Her instincts screamed at her to grab the children and run into the woods, but she was frozen, paralyzed by the certainty of what was about to happen. He had found her. The driver's door opened with a soft, expensive click. A man stepped out. He was in his late 60s, with a full head of perfectly coiffed silver hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the cold, reptilian stillness of his eyes. He was dressed in a dark, tailored business suit, a vision of wealth and power that was utterly incongruous with the surrounding rot. He stood for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over the dilapidated house, not with disgust, but with the cold, calculating appraisal of a butcher examining a side of meat. He moved with a predator's economy of motion, an unnerving blend of aged grace and raw power. Ilara shrank back from the window, her throat closing up. She didn't need the diary to tell her who this was. She felt his identity in her bones, a primal recognition of the monster from the story. This was Julian Ashford, He moved toward the house, his polished shoes navigating the mud with an uncanny neatness. Alara felt a tremor run through her body as she heard his footsteps on the rotted wood of the porch. A firm, authoritative knock rattled the door in its frame. "Ms. Vance?" The voice was smooth, cultured, and laced with tempered steel. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Alara's mind screamed. The children were playing in the back, trying to dam a small stream of rainwater. They were vulnerable. She was vulnerable. She felt cornered, a rat trapped in a collapsing maze. Taking a ragged, shuddering breath that did nothing to calm the frantic beating of her heart, she forced her leaden feet to move. She had to face him. She pulled the door open, the screech of the single hinge a cry of protest. She stood before him, a ghost in her own horror story. The man, Ashford, smiled, but the expression was a grotesque parody of warmth. It was a baring of teeth, a display of dominance. His eyes, the color of chips of ice, raked over her, taking in her worn clothes and the exhaustion etched on her face. "Julian Ashford," he announced, extending a manicured hand that she pointedly ignored. "My condolences on your loss. I own the surrounding timberlands and heard you'd taken up residence. I had to come and see if you were all right." His gaze flickered past her into the dark, ruined interior. "My God," he said, his voice dripping with false pity. "This place is a death trap, completely worthless." His eyes, cold and sharp, darted for a split second to the section of floor she had pried open and replaced. A jolt of pure electric terror shot through Alara. He wasn't just guessing. He knew where the secret was hidden, or where it was supposed to be. He cut through the pleasantries, his voice hardening slightly. "Look, Ms. Vance, I'll be direct. This property is an eyesore and a liability. I've been trying to purchase it for decades to consolidate my estate. Out of the goodness of my heart, and considering your tragic circumstances, I am prepared to offer you $5,000 for it. In cash. You and your children can be out of this hellhole by nightfall." The offer was a calculated insult, a chess move designed to gauge her reaction. $5,000 for the land that held the key to his entire life of crime. A bitter eye. Cold fury began to bubble up beneath Alara's terror. She thought of her husband, of the fisherman's son, of Thomas Vance's life of fear. She managed to find her voice, a dry, cracking whisper. "No, I need to think about it." The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken threats. The fake smile evaporated from Julian Ashford's face. The mask of the benevolent patriarch fell away, and for a terrifying second, Alara saw the remorseless killer from the diary. His voice dropped to a low, menacing whisper, a sound more frightening than any shout. "Don't think too long. This is a very dangerous area for a woman alone. The roof could collapse in the next storm. The lake is deep and cold." He paused, letting the words sink in, his icy gaze boring into hers. Then he delivered the final, devastating blow. "It's a terrible shame, isn't it? How accidents just seem to run in your husband's family." The threat was as clear and sharp as a shard of glass, linking her husband's death directly to this man and this land. He turned without another word and walked back to his car, leaving her frozen, her blood like ice in her veins. What would you do in her place? Would you take the dirty money and run for your life? Or would you stand your ground and fight for justice, knowing that this man has killed before and will not hesitate to kill again? Ashford's words hung in the air long after the purr of his sedan faded, a poison that seeped into the very timbers of the rotting house. Accidents seem to run in your husband's family. The veiled threat was a physical thing, a cold hand squeezing Alara's heart until she could barely breathe. The world seemed to tilt, the line between her husband's tragic death and the dark history of this land blurring into a single, terrifying certainty. He was murdered. The thought, once a formless suspicion, was now a solid, sharp-edged conviction in her gut. She stumbled back inside the house, the stench of mold and decay no longer smelling of neglect, but of malice. Every shadow seemed to lengthen. Every creak of a floorboard sounded like a footstep. She was no longer a widow hiding from debt. She was a witness hiding from a killer. The house wasn't a ruin, it was a hunting blind, and she was the prey. A violent tremor shook her body, a fever of pure, undiluted terror. She felt utterly, terrifyingly exposed. She rushed to the corner where the children were playing, their innocent chatter a painful counterpoint to the silent scream in her own mind. She gathered them into her arms. Holding them so tightly, Chloe let out a small whimper of protest. Alara buried her face in Liam's hair, inhaling the scent of her son, a desperate anchor in a world that was dissolving into a nightmare. She could feel Ashford's icy gaze on her still, a phantom presence that watched from the dark tree line. The paranoia described in Thomas Vance's diary was no longer a story. It was her reality. She was living the final, frantic pages of his life. The house, which she had hated for its decay, now felt like a death trap of her own making. She had brought her children here. She had led them into the monster's territory, ringing the dinner bell with her mere presence. A wave of self-loathing washed over her, so potent it felt like bile rising in her throat. She had to get them out. But how? And where? The evidence was a burning weight in her mind. The gun, the diary, the negatives. After Ashford's visit, she had known the spare tire in the car was too obvious. In a frantic search for a better hiding spot, she had found it. A small, hollow cavity behind a loose stone in the old fireplace chimney. A place so coated in soot and creosote that no one would think to look. Now, that secret felt like a bomb strapped to her chest. She couldn't leave it, but she couldn't stay with it. Her mind raced, a chaotic whirlwind of impossible options. There was no cell service to call for help, and the nearest town was miles away, likely filled with people on Ashford's payroll. He owned the county, Thomas had written. The local law enforcement was in his pocket. A profound sense of helplessness crashed down on her, a suffocating blanket of despair. She was cut off, surrounded, a lone soldier on an island controlled entirely by the enemy. There was no escape. Then, a fragment of a sentence from the diary surfaced through the fog of her panic. A fisherman, Old Man Hemlock's boy. The name, Hemlock, snagged in her thoughts. Could it be possible? 40 years was a long time, but people stayed in these remote parts. Families clung to the land. She remembered, in the first days of her arrival, noticing a thin, persistent wisp of white smoke rising from the opposite side of the lake, far down the shoreline. It was the only sign of human life she had seen, a silent signal in the vast, indifferent wilderness. At the time, she had been too consumed by her own misery to give it much thought. Now, it was a beacon, a desperate, terrifying, razor-thin sliver of hope. What if a Hemlock still lived there? What if the keeper of that distant fire held a piece of the story? It was a wild, insane gamble, but it was the only one she had. The alternative was to wait for Ashford to stop making threats and start creating another accident. The decision, once made, filled her with a new kind of terror, the fear of action. The journey across the lake felt like a descent into the underworld. The only vessel available was a small, dilapidated rowboat half submerged in the mud near the collapsing boathouse, its wood soft and punky with rot. As she dragged it to the water's edge, its bottom scraped against the gravel, the sound grating on her raw nerves. She told the children it was an adventure, a game, her voice a brittle, high-pitched imitation of cheerfulness that sounded insane even to her own ears. Liam was silent, his eyes wide with an understanding beyond his years. Chloe clung to her hand, her small body trembling. The lake itself was a character in this horror story, its murky, stagnant surface hiding the body of a murdered boy. The water was unnaturally cold as it lapped against her ankles, a chilling reminder of the secrets it kept. Alara felt a primal urge to recoil, to run back to the devil she knew. Getting the children into the boat was a nightmare. It rocked violently with every shift in weight, threatening to swamp them in the foul-smelling, green-scummed water. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the oppressive silence of the lake. Finally, they were settled, and she pushed off, the boat groaning in protest. The oars were heavy and unbalanced, and her first few strokes were clumsy, splashing the cold, dirty water onto her jeans. The smell was nauseating, a thick, organic stench of decay. With each pull, she felt as if she were disturbing a grave. She didn't dare look down into the opaque brown depths, terrified of what she might see in her imagination. The sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long, distorted shadows across the water. The house she was leaving behind looked like a skull on the shore, its empty windows like hollow eye sockets watching her go. The journey was an eternity, The silence was broken only by the rhythmic creak and splash of the oars and the frantic, shallow breath she took. Mosquitoes whined in a cloud around her head, but she didn't have a free hand to wave them away. Her muscles, unused to the strain, quickly began to burn. Her hands, already raw from her work in the garden, were screaming in protest, blisters forming and breaking on her palms. But she didn't stop. She rowed with a frantic, desperate energy, fueled by the image of Julian Ashford's cold eyes and the memory of his final, chilling words. She was rowing away from a murderer, but also towards a complete unknown. The thin column of smoke was her only guide, a fragile thread pulling her across the abyss. As she got closer, the details of the far shore began to resolve. A small, sturdy-looking dock, and behind it, nestled in the trees, a small, neat cabin. The cabin was the complete antithesis of her own. It was small and built of dark, solid logs, with a stone chimney from which the smoke rose in a steady, comforting stream. The windows were clean, and there were neatly stacked cords of firewood along one wall. A small, well-tended garden grew in a patch of sunlight. This was a place of order, of life. It felt like arriving in a different world. As the bow of the rowboat bumped against the solid wood of the dock, a figure emerged from the cabin. It was an old man, tall and gaunt, with a shock of white hair and a face as weathered as the landscape. He moved slowly, deliberately, a rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. He didn't raise it, but its presence was a clear, unambiguous statement. He stood at the edge of his dock and simply watched her, his eyes, even from a distance, sharp and appraising. Ilara's throat went dry. Her desperate gamble had led her here to a silent old man with a gun. She secured the boat with trembling hands, her body screaming with exhaustion. "Hello," she called out, her voice thin and reedy, easily swallowed by the immense silence. I'm your new neighbor, from across the lake." The man didn't answer. He just stood there, his gaze unwavering, taking in her disheveled appearance, the terrified faces of her children in the boat. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Ilara felt a fresh wave of despair. This was a mistake. She had traded one danger for another, disturbing a recluse who clearly wanted nothing to do with the world. She was about to stammer an apology, to turn the boat around and row back to her own personal hell, when she remembered the cufflink. It was her only key, her only proof that she wasn't just some crazy woman in a rowboat. With a shaking hand, she reached into her pocket and pulled it out, holding it up so the last rays of sunlight caught the tarnished silver. The man's posture changed instantly. He took a single, sharp step forward. He gestured with his head for her to come ashore. His silence was more unnerving than any torrent of questions would have been. Ilara helped her children out of the boat onto the solid dock, their feet unsteady on the firm surface. She approached him slowly, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. Up close, his face was a roadmap of grief and hard living, his pale blue eyes holding a sorrow so deep it seemed ancient. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the cufflink in her outstretched, trembling palm. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, like stones grinding together. It was the first time he had spoken, and the sound was filled with a pain that was 40 years old. "I found it," Ilara whispered, her voice cracking. "Buried, behind the house. There was more, a diary, and a gun." The old man's eyes finally lifted to meet hers, and in their depths, she saw the last 40 years of suspicion and rage flare into a single, terrible point of certainty. "My name is Arthur Hemlock," he said, his voice raw. He finally looked away from the cufflink, his gaze drifting out over the dark water of the lake, a haunted, distant look in his eyes. "The boy the diary talks about. The witness. He was my younger brother, Daniel." The words struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't just talking to a neighbor. She was talking to the living legacy of Ashford's first murder, the man who had been living beside this watery grave for 4 decades. A profound wave of empathy and shared grief washed over her, momentarily eclipsing her own fear. Arthur led them inside his cabin. It was spare and impeccably clean, filled with the scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee. He sat Ilara at a small wooden table while the children, exhausted and overwhelmed, huddled together on a nearby rag rug, finally succumbing to sleep. The weight of the secret she had been carrying alone suddenly felt a little lighter, shared now with the one other person in the world who had a right to it. She told him everything. The words tumbled out of her in a frantic, desperate rush. The foreclosure, the false hope of the inheritance, the discovery of the ruin. Her voice broke as she described finding the box, the cuff link, the lead-lined compartment. She described the gun, the diary, the ghostly negatives. The story sounded insane, a fever dream, but Arthur Hemlock listened without interruption, his weathered face an unreadable mask, his hands resting motionless on the table. When she got to the part about Julian Ashford's visit, his calm finally broke. A low, guttural sound, a noise of pure hatred, escaped his lips. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the table. He knew the name. He had lived with the poison of that name for 40 years, waiting for a day he thought would never come. When she finished, the only sound in the small cabin was the crackle of the fire and the soft, sleeping breaths of her children. "I always knew," Arthur said, his voice barely a whisper. The sheriff back then, he was one of Ashford's first purchases. He called it an accidental drowning. Said my brother fell out of his boat. But Daniel, he was practically born on this lake. He was a better swimmer than any fish. He looked at Alara, his eyes burning with a cold fire she recognized. The same fire she now felt in her own soul. They never found the body. Ashford owns the lake bottom too, I suppose. A bitter, humorless smile twisted his lips. The pieces of the puzzle were slotting together, forming a picture of unimaginable evil, an evil that had been allowed to fester and grow for decades, consuming everything it touched. Ilara felt a cold dread mixed with a grim sense of purpose. This was bigger than her debt. This was about justice for Daniel, for Thomas Vance, and for her husband. The final, crucial piece of the story was about to be laid on the table. Then, Arthur Hemlock's expression shifted. A new, more recent pain entered his eyes. He leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower, becoming urgent. "But that's not all you need to know, Ms. Vance. The past. It's not the past." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "Your husband, Robert, was it? He came to see me, just over a month ago." Ilara's blood ran cold. She felt a wave of dizziness. Gripping the table to steady herself, Robert had been here. He had spoken to this man. He had found some of his great-uncle's old papers, some notes. He was confused. He had questions about the property, about an old payroll robbery. He said he felt like he was on the verge of uncovering something important. Arthur's words were hammer blows, each one striking the same raw nerve. Her husband hadn't stumbled into this by accident. He had been investigating. He had been retracing the steps of his great-uncle's crime, walking the same dangerous path. "He asked me about Julian Ashford," Arthur continued, his voice heavy with a terrible dawning guilt. "I was cautious. I've been cautious for 40 years. I told him to be careful, that some stones are better left unturned. I told him Ashford was a dangerous man. He didn't listen. He was a good man, a determined man. He said he had to know the truth about his family's history." Arthur's gaze dropped to his hands. He worked at the logging site up on the North Ridge, an Ashford-owned site. 2 weeks after he spoke to me, I heard about the accident. The unspoken conclusion hung in the air between them, heavy and lethal. It wasn't just a threat. Ashford had already done it. He had killed her husband to stop him from uncovering the very same secret that she now held. The grief that Ilara had been carrying for months transformed in that instant, hardening from a soft, aching sorrow into something cold, sharp, and diamond-hard rage. The last sliver of daylight vanished, plunging the world outside the cabin into an inky, moonless black. The fire in the hearth cast flickering, dancing shadows on the walls, making the small space feel both like a sanctuary and a cage. Arthur stood up and walked to the window, peering out across the dark expanse of the lake toward her house. "You and the children will stay here tonight," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "It's not safe for you over there. Not anymore. In the morning, we'll figure out what to do." Relief, profound and overwhelming, washed over Ilara. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she wasn't completely alone. She had an ally, an old, tired man armed with a 40-year-old grudge and a hunting rifle. but an ally nonetheless. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She looked at her sleeping children, their faces peaceful and angelic in the firelight. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe they might actually be safe. It was Arthur who saw it first. He stiffened at the window, his body going rigid. "What is it?" Ilara asked, a fresh spike of adrenaline lancing through her. "Smoke," he said, his voice a low, tight growl. "But it's not from my chimney." He pointed a trembling finger across the lake. Ilara scrambled to the window and peered into the darkness. At first, she saw nothing but the impenetrable black of the night. Then she saw it, a faint, unnatural orange glow, flickering against the dark silhouette of the trees on her property. It was small at first, a single pulsing ember, but even as she watched, it grew, brightening, casting a sickly, dancing light. It was coming from the shoreline, from the direction of her collapsing boathouse. Her blood turned to ice. It was a fire on a damp, windless night. There was only one way that could have happened. They were here, Ashford's men. The orange glow intensified with terrifying speed, the flames licking hungrily at the dry, rotted wood of the old structure. The fire wasn't meant to destroy the house. Not yet. It was a signal, a lure, a way to flush her out into the open to create chaos and confusion. Ilara's heart hammered in her chest so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She felt a primal, suffocating panic rise in her throat. They thought she was in the house. They were trying to smoke her out like a rat from a drain pipe. She could almost feel the heat from across the lake, could almost smell the acrid smoke of her last, pathetic refuge burning. The idyllic silence of the night was shattered. They were done waiting. They were done making threats. The hunt had begun in earnest, and the time for running and hiding was over. They had come for the evidence, and they would not leave without it. Then, another sound cut through the night, a sound that made the hair on her arms stand on end. It was the low, guttural roar of a heavy-duty truck engine, much louder and closer than Ashford's sedan had been. It echoed across the water, a sound of brutal, mechanical power. Headlights sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the front of her house before being abruptly cut. The silence that followed was somehow more menacing. A car door slammed, then another. Voices, low and indistinct, carried across the water. Ilara's breath hitched in her throat. She could see them now. Two large, broad-shouldered silhouettes, moving with purpose against the backdrop of the blazing boathouse. They weren't police. They weren't neighbors. They were thugs, hired muscle, Ashford's loose ends specialists. They moved toward the front door of her house, their shapes black and monstrous against the swirling orange flames. "They're going to tear the place apart looking for it," Arthur whispered, his voice grim. Ilara's mind raced. The evidence, the gun, the diary, the negatives. She had hidden them in the chimney. A cold, sickening realization washed over her. She hadn't brought them with her. In her frantic, terrified flight across the lake, she had left the one thing that mattered, the one thing that could bring Ashford down, the one thing that was keeping her and her children alive. The evidence was still in the house. In the house with them, the men were at the front door now. A loud, splintering crash echoed across the water, the sound of the door being kicked in. They were inside. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over Ilara. All of this, the running, the hiding, the desperate gamble of coming here, it was all for nothing if they found the evidence. She had failed. It was over. "There's a root cellar," Arthur said suddenly, his voice sharp, pulling her back from the edge of despair. He stamped his foot on a section of the floor near the hearth. "The old bootleggers built them all over this area. It has an exit that comes up in the woods, 50 yards behind the cabin. Take the children. Go now. Run and don't look back." He grabbed his rifle from its spot by the door, his movements fluid and practiced. He was preparing to make a stand. But Ilara was frozen. The evidence. It was everything. Without it, her story was nothing. Without it, Ashford would walk away clean, and she and her children would be hunted for the rest of their lives. A desperate, insane idea began to form in her mind, a plan born of pure, maternal rage. She couldn't run. Not yet. She had to go back. She had to get the evidence. It was a suicide mission, but her children's future depended on it. Before Arthur could react, before she could second-guess the madness of her own plan, she was moving. "Watch them," she gasped, gesturing to her sleeping children. And then she was out the door, plunging into the pitch-black woods that separated the two properties. The cold night air was a shock to her lungs, and the smell of wood smoke was thick and suffocating. She ran, her feet stumbling over roots and rocks she couldn't see. The sounds from across the lake grew louder. The angry roar of the fire, the crash of things being broken and overturned inside her house. Her mind was a singular white-hot point of focus. The chimney. Get the evidence. Get out. Thorns and branches tore at her clothes and skin, but she didn't feel them. The only thing she felt was the frantic, desperate race against time. She was running toward the fire, toward the monsters. Her heart a wild drum beating out a rhythm of terror and resolve. She burst through the tree line into the clearing behind her house. The boathouse was now a roaring inferno, casting the entire area in a terrifying, flickering orange light. The heat was a physical blow, and the air was thick with smoke that burned her eyes and throat. The men's voices were louder now, angry and frustrated, coming from inside the house. "It's not here. Check the bedrooms," one of them shouted. They hadn't found it yet. She still had a chance. She crept along the back wall of the house, staying low in the shadows, her breath coming in ragged, silent gasps. She reached the rear kitchen window, its glass long since shattered. The sounds from inside were of pure destruction, wood splintering, glass breaking, furniture being thrown. Her heart pounded in her ears, a deafening roar that threatened to betray her presence. She had to get inside, get to the fireplace, and get out before they circled back to the living room. She hoisted herself through the broken window, landing silently on the grimy linoleum of the kitchen floor. The interior of the house was a chaotic nightmare of overturned furniture and debris, illuminated by the hellish orange light from the fire outside. The air was thick with smoke and the dust of destruction. She could hear the men rampaging in the small bedrooms down the hall, their heavy footsteps shaking the entire structure. Her stomach was a cold, tight knot of terror. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but the image of her children's faces, and the cold reality of a life spent looking over her shoulder, propelled her forward. She crept into the living room, her bare feet making no sound on the filthy floor. The fireplace was just across the room, a gaping maw of blackness. It felt 100 miles away. One of the men shouted from the hallway, his voice closer now. "Nothing. Let's check the main room again." There was no more time. Adrenaline, pure and potent, surged through her. She scrambled across the room on her hands and knees, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. She reached the fireplace, her fingers fumbling blindly along the cold, soot-covered stones inside. Her hand closed around the loose rock. It wouldn't budge. It was stuck. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She could hear the heavy footsteps approaching the living room doorway. With a surge of desperate strength, she wrenched at the stone, tearing her fingernails. It came free with a grinding scrape. She plunged her hand into the dark, dusty cavity behind it, and her fingers closed around the plastic-wrapped bundle. She had it. At that exact moment, a massive figure filled the doorway, his form silhouetted against the light from the hall. He saw her. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "There you are." He started to move toward her, a predator closing in on its cornered prey. Elara didn't think. She acted. To his left was the main door they had kicked in. To her right, in the corner of the room, was something she had noticed days ago but paid little attention to. A square trapdoor in the floor, its iron ring pull rusted and flush with the wood. The root cellar, the one her husband had told her stories about. A Prohibition-era escape route. With a choked sob of terror, she scrambled toward it, clutching the precious bundle to her chest. The man lunged for her, his fingers brushing the back of her shirt. She hooked her fingers through the iron ring and pulled with all her might. For a heart-stopping second, it held fast, rusted shut. Then, with a deep groan of tortured wood, it gave way. She ripped the door open, revealing a square of absolute blackness and the smell of damp earth. Without a moment's hesitation, she swung her legs into the hole and dropped into the darkness below. Just as the man's heavy boot slammed down where her head had been, she landed hard on a dirt floor, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. Above her, the man roared in frustration, She could hear his partner shouting. For a terrifying second, she thought he would follow her down. Instead, she heard them scrambling away, their voices urgent. "Forget her. Just burn it. Burn it all down." The smell of gasoline, sharp and chemical, suddenly filled the air. They weren't just going to burn the evidence. They were going to burn her with it. Scrambling in the pitch black, her hands frantically searched the damp earth walls of the cellar. She found it, a rough-hewn tunnel, barely tall enough to crawl through. She plunged into the narrow space, the sounds from the house growing fainter behind her. She crawled on her hands and knees through the suffocating darkness, the precious bundle clutched in one hand, the smell of gasoline and smoke filling the tunnel behind her. She was crawling away from the flames, into the black, unknown heart of the forest. The tunnel was an eternity of darkness, dirt, and fear. The air grew thin, and her lungs burned for oxygen. The smell of smoke was overpowering. She could hear the faint, terrifying roar as the main house caught fire, a sound like a hungry beast devouring its prey. Just when she thought she would suffocate, she felt a draft of cool, fresh air on her face. She saw a faint patch of gray ahead, the exit. She burst out of the tunnel into a thicket of ferns 50 yards into the woods, gasping, sobbing, gulping down the clean night air. Behind her, the sky was a blazing, apocalyptic orange. Her house, her last refuge, the tomb of Thomas Vance's secrets, was being erased from the earth. She was on her feet, still clutching the bundle and running. She ran blindly through the forest, away from the fire, away from the men, her only thought to get back to Arthur's cabin, back to her children. The climax was over, but the chase had just begun. She stumbled back into Arthur's cabin, a wild, soot-stained creature emerging from the dark. The children were awake, crying, terrified by the commotion. Arthur was standing by the door, rifle in hand, his face a grim mask of relief and horror. He saw the bundle in her hand, and a flicker of something like triumph lit his tired eyes. "They burned it," she gasped, collapsing to her knees, her body finally giving in to the violent shivers of shock and exhaustion. They burned everything. Outside, the fire raged, a funeral pyre for the house and its secrets. But she had it. She had the truth in her hands. She had the gun that had killed his brother, the diary that confessed the crime, and the negatives that proved the lie. She had paid a terrible price, escaping one inferno only to find herself in another. But she had survived. She had the weapon she needed to fight back. The long night was far from over, but for the first time, Elara Vance had a fighting chance. The cabin was a tiny island of light in an ocean of darkness, the roar of the distant fire a constant, terrible reminder of their escape. Arthur Hemlock stood by the phone, a relic from another era, his voice a low, urgent murmur that cut through the night. He was not calling the local sheriff. He was cashing a chip he had held for half a century, a debt owed to him by a man who now held the title of state prosecutor. Elara knelt on the floor, her body trembling with a violent, uncontrollable mix of adrenaline and exhaustion. She clutched the plastic-wrapped bundle to her chest, its contents both a death sentence and a prayer. Soot stained her face like war paint, and the acrid smell of smoke clung to her hair and clothes. She watched her children, huddled under a rough wool blanket, their eyes wide with a terror they couldn't comprehend. In the grim set of Arthur's jaw and the hard, determined glint in his eyes, she saw not the end of a nightmare, but the beginning of the war. The fire across the lake was a funeral pyre, but it was also a declaration. Before the first hint of dawn could stain the eastern sky, they were moving. Arthur's old truck rumbled to life, its engine a comforting growl in the pre-dawn stillness. They drove for over an hour on dark, winding back roads, a route Arthur knew by heart, designed to avoid any possibility of being seen. They met the prosecutor not in an office, but in a desolate, all-night diner 2 counties away, a pocket of fluorescent light in the vast darkness. The prosecutor was a woman named Maria Sharp, her face stern, her eyes intelligent and weary. She listened without interruption as Elara, her voice hoarse and cracking, recounted the entire story, the words tumbling out in a torrent of fear and fury. Arthur sat beside her, a silent, grim sentinel. Finally, Elara placed the bundle on the worn Formica tabletop. With trembling hands, she unwrapped the .38 revolver, its blued steel gleaming under the harsh lights. She pushed the diary and the negatives across the table. The air crackled with a silence 40 years in the making. Prosecutor Sharp handled the evidence with a reverence that bordered on clinical. She didn't doubt. The story was too specific, the evidence too tangible, the terror in Alara's eyes too real. Within hours, the full, untouchable weight of the state's investigative power was brought to bear. In a sterile lab far from Ashford's sphere of influence, the revolver was examined. A ballistics expert's voice, calm and professional, confirmed the match over a secure line. The rifling patterns on the bullets fired from the .38 were a perfect, undeniable match to the slugs recovered from the cold case file of Daniel Hemlock. The ink in the diary was analyzed, its age confirmed. The paper itself was traced to a batch sold in the early 1980s. The photographic negatives, once blurry ghosts of a forgotten crime, were scanned and digitized by forensic imaging specialists. Under their expert hands, the shadows gave way. A young Julian Ashford's face, twisted in a snarl, became horrifyingly clear, forever frozen in the moment of his murderous act. The raid was not a local affair. It was an invasion. Just as the sun crested the horizon, casting a golden light over Julian Ashford's palatial estate, a convoy of dark, unmarked SUVs belonging to the state police stormed the wrought iron gates, bypassing his personal security with swift, brutal efficiency. There were no sirens, only the crunch of tires on pristine gravel and the sharp, barked commands of tactical officers. They moved with the silent, deadly purpose of a wolf pack, securing the perimeter and sweeping into the mansion. Ashford appeared on a high balcony, dressed in a silk robe, his face a mask of arrogant fury. He started to scream about lawyers and trespass, but his voice was cut off as he saw the letters emblazoned on the officers' vests, State Police. He saw the prosecutor, Maria Sharp, standing on his lawn, holding a warrant. The color drained from his face as he realized, with dawning horror, that his entire network of local influence, the shield he had spent a lifetime building, was utterly useless. The moment of his arrest was a quiet, anticlimactic counterpoint to the decades of violence he had wrought. Two officers led him down the grand and decurving staircase of his own home. The cold, reptilian eyes that had paralyzed Alara with fear were now wide with disbelief and impotent rage. He was no longer a timber magnate, a pillar of the community. He was just an old man in a robe, his carefully manicured hands clamped behind his back in cold steel handcuffs. The soft click of the cuffs locking was the sound of a 40-year reign of terror coming to an end. Maria Sharp read him his rights, her voice clear and steady in the morning air. The charges were a litany of his secret life: murder in the first degree for the death of Daniel Hemlock, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Robert Vance. As he was led to a waiting vehicle, stripped of his power and dignity, he looked like what he was, a monster finally dragged out of the darkness and into the unforgiving light of day. Weeks later, the world had transformed. Alara sat not in a rotting house or a grimy diner, but in a clean, quiet law office, the air smelling of leather and success. The prosecutor explained the resolution. The evidence was ironclad, and faced with a life in prison, several of Ashford's subordinates had turned state's evidence, corroborating every detail of the diary and implicating him in Robert Vance's murder. With his criminal empire collapsing, the state seized his assets, including the vast sums of money directly traceable to the 1982 Silver Creek payroll robbery. Prosecutor Sharp slid a document across the polished mahogany desk. As the legal heir of the primary whistleblower, Thomas Vance, and for your direct role in bringing this to light, the state has awarded you a significant portion of the recovered funds as a reward. The number on the paper made Alara's vision swim. It was a figure that didn't just erase her debt, it erased her entire past of poverty and fear. The weight of generations had finally been lifted. The first thing she did felt both monumental and beautifully simple. She walked into a grocery store, not with a handful of crumpled bills and a stomach twisted with anxiety, but with a sense of quiet, profound peace. She pushed a cart through aisles bursting with color and abundance. The scent of fresh bread from the bakery, the cool mist in the produce section, the sight of a fully stocked meat counter. It was a sensory overload that brought tears to her eyes. She filled her cart without looking at prices. Fresh fruit, vegetables, steaks, milk, and a ridiculously large chocolate cake. At the checkout, she paid with a debit card, a simple piece of plastic that represented her new freedom. The cashier smiled. A simple human interaction devoid of the pity or suspicion Alara had grown so accustomed to. Driving away, the bags filling her car with the smell of real food, she didn't feel rich. She felt something far better. She felt safe. Her stomach didn't hurt from hunger. It fluttered with the simple, joyful anticipation of cooking for her children. She did not sell the land by the lake. It was her history, her battlefield, and now, her spoils. She hired a team of contractors, and the sounds that echoed across the water were no longer of decay, but of creation. The rhythmic thud of hammers replaced the slow, maddening drip of water. The whine of power saws replaced the howl of the wind through broken panes. The collapsed roof was removed, and new, sturdy trusses were raised against the sky. The walls, once covered in the black, cancerous blooms of mold, were stripped to the studs and rebuilt. New windows were installed, their clean glass reflecting the blue of the sky and the calm surface of the lake. The smell of rot and stagnation was replaced by the clean, sharp scent of fresh-cut pine and sawdust. She stood with Arthur on the newly built porch, watching the sunset paint the water in hues of orange and purple. The lake was no longer a grave. It was just a lake, its secrets finally given up to the light. 6 months later, the house was a home. It was filled with light, with warmth, with the scent of cinnamon and roasting chicken. The silence was not the oppressive, heavy quiet of despair, but the peaceful hum of a happy life, the buzz of a refrigerator, the gentle murmur of the television, the sound of her children's laughter. Alara stood in her bright, modern kitchen pulling a golden brown roast from the oven. Liam and Chloe sat at a large wooden table, their faces glowing with health and happiness, no longer etched with the premature worry of their past life. They were arguing playfully over a board game, their voices filling the space with a music Alara had thought she might never hear again. She served the meal, her heart swelling with a feeling so profound it ached. It was a feeling of peace, of security, of belonging. She was not a widow, a debtor, or a victim. She was simply a mother, in her own home, watching her children eat, finally, truly safe. The woman who had once clutched a foreclosure notice with her last $300 to her name felt like a character from someone else's story. The journey from the absolute bottom had been a trial by fire, a desperate crawl through the darkest parts of the human heart. But she had emerged from the flames not just alive, but reborn. She had faced down a monster and had reclaimed not only her own future, but justice for all of his victims. Her victory was not loud. It was written in the quiet moments, the taste of a home-cooked meal, the feel of a solid roof over her head, the precious, priceless sound of her children sleeping soundly through the night. The ghosts of the lake house were finally at peace. Alara Vance's story proves that even in the deepest darkness, the strength to fight back can be found. What secrets lie buried in your own life, waiting for the right person to unearth them? Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications, because the most shocking stories are the ones that are true.